Greetings and welcome back to another iteration of MGTOW Talks, and I'm here again with the fabulous and now renowned Coltane to talk about an interesting topic that I think must be talked about. That is, well, two topics in fact. What is an ideal society? And we'll be talking a lot about that. And then following that, MGTOW ideology, which I'm using the air quotes, ideology. But I want to, before going into this, and I'm going to give Coltane the podium, a lot of this sort of conversation, sprung forth from a comment left on the original video that we had done about a week or so ago by Divided Line, and Divided Line makes some interesting comments. I'm going to read it off and then we'll proceed. Divided Line stated, recognizing female nature or human nature doesn't make political action impossible. It just suggests different political action. We have to consciously design institutions. They don't design themselves. We either make our political arrangements based on ideological fantasy, or we can make them based on our understanding of what is objectively true about human biology. Even if female and group preference and white knighting are innate and rooted in sociobiological condition, it is also true that self-awareness, the capacity for symbolic thinking, and the recognition of wider causal relations are innate and sociobiological. It's the defining characteristic of our species, an ability which is just as rooted in natural selection as any other. Knowledge is the precondition of will, and therefore of choice, because people can't make choices they're not aware of. Nor can they make any meaningful choice if it isn't clear what the likely outcome of each choice will be. Without knowledge, there is no choice, and what we're talking about here with respects to gender are those areas of our life where people don't have knowledge. In refusing to engage critically with feminism, which will march onward regardless of the spotlight, you ensure that people remain without that knowledge and therefore choice. Without knowledge of ourselves and one another, we're doomed to keep repeating the same socio-biological dictates. Just because a pattern of human behavior is apparent doesn't mean it is determined, since awareness of the pattern would be the prerequisite for breaking it and establishing a new one, if it was at all possible. Lacking subjunctive there, if it were. With that knowledge, only then we can make the choice about it one way or another. So, Coltane, take the podium. What do you have to say?
Well, I mean, first of all, disclaimer, we're not hating on Divided Line or anything. It's just that his comment is a really good springboard for this kind of discussion. I was actually hoping that someone would leave a comment to this effect on our last video. Once you do kind of accept that things are fundamentally biological, that the ultimate causes are biological, the question is, where do you go from there? I think the problem with this way of thinking, that once you understand nature, you can use it to make political action possible. I guess the key problem I have looking at his reasoning here is that much of what he's coming at is from the idea that choices are preceded by knowledge. And I don't think that's always the case. I mean, he pretty much says, we can make our political arrangements based on ideological fantasy, or we can make them based on, objective knowledge of human biology. But I mean, there is a third option at the lower level, that these things actually are emergent and emerge from a state of, instinctual biology. And then we basically craft these ideologies as a post hoc rationalization to justify doing things that we didn't really consciously come to.
Yeah, okay, if I might. Yeah, I'm absolutely in agreement with that, and not just for the sake of agreeing, because I do agree with you. And let me bring up a paraphrase from Barbarossa. I don't remember which video it was, or it's not an exact quote, but he said something to the effect, it was maybe a year or so ago, either we come up with a better lie than feminism, with respect to society, of course, either we come up with a better lie than feminism, or we craft or we create a society that's an actual reflection of human nature. Now, as you mentioned just prior, this is the sort of the foundation or the fundamental is-ought problem that was coined by I'm sure most of you know, the historian and philosopher David Hume, Scottish philosopher. And if you're not familiar with the is-ought problem, quite simply stated, it's that descriptive statements about the way things aren't necessarily the prerequisites, requirements, or really are basically insufficient to give you prescriptive or normative statements. So because A is such, therefore B, basically. And that is the is-ought problem in a nutshell. And I think that's really what we're talking about, essentially.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's essentially the problem of looking at these things and describing them and then making the assumption that those descriptions are actually prescriptive. For example, I replied to Divided Line's comment saying, basically what I just said there. And he wrote back saying that we do actually intentionally design institutions, and that a good example of that would be traditional marriage. And he talked about how it was a socially crafted institution that provided a set of rules and roles for people to follow to create a cohesive social fabric, I guess. And it's very easy to look at the past and see how traditional marriage worked and come to that conclusion that traditional marriage was a prescriptive designed institution with rules and all of that sort of stuff. But I look at it and I'm like, oh, how quickly that well-designed institution fell to pieces as soon as medical birth control appeared. My thoughts are that what traditional marriage really was simply the most optimal and equilibrial state for biological reproduction given the environmental conditions at the time. Like, as a woman 150 years ago, you couldn't have a kid and financially support it. The labor was hard. It was just impossible. You really had to be married to financially support a family. And the whole no sex before marriage, I guess, was their form of birth control. So as soon as that form of birth control got superseded by more convenient medical birth controls, that form of birth control sort of fell by the wayside. I think what we call traditional marriage is actually us just putting a label on the most convenient biological arrangement of the time. Now that we have birth control, that is now no longer biologically convenient. It's no longer the most.
That's one example. I mean, obviously, something, I'm not going to talk about Marxism, but we also forget, just to mention it, the legislation that was passed that made escape from marriage for women so easy, and how they just all drop their marriages like a hat as well. Once again, the fragility of the marriage institution. But I think you're absolutely right about.
But I mean, even that dropping the the marriage institution, that was only feasible, like biologically feasible,
given technological realities. Yeah. I mean, how many times I've talked about the mechanization? I'm adding to that. I'm saying
Yeah. I'm just saying it's all part of the same thing as far as I'm concerned.
And I think it is somewhat deceptive to think that these institutions have a conscious design. I think these things tend to arise organically from the way human beings are, the way men are, the way women are. And just as the state of current affairs and relationships and marriage and intersexual interaction, it has essentially an organic component. Now, what do I mean in this context by organic? I mean a lot of subconscious stuff going on that, as you said, is then thereafter in a post hoc rationalization or an afterthought said, well, I did this, I did Y because of X, but the reality is there might have been any number of variables that are not being taken into account. So I think very little in the way of human institutions is there by conscious design. There are certainly elements of the conscious, but I think it's much muddier than that. It's more complicated, and you're going to have an interplay between the conscious and the subconscious. And and once again, getting back to the is-ought problem, the as I said in the Girl Writes What video, I just, even understanding fairly well, I think, how human beings are and how they interact, I just can't really commit myself to some statement or prescription of how things should be, because I just don't know. I don't know what is optimal. I don't know what is
Yeah.
best. And
Well,
please.
that kind of brings up a question that I don't think anyone really wants to ask, which is, like, if we try very carefully not to cross the is-ought gap, like, because I'm the same with you, I don't know what the most optimal situation is. But if we are to basically say, biology is going to settle on what is most optimal, given
I'm
the
sorry for
biology.
interrupting. It's optimal. Most optimal is. I'm sorry. So sorry.
Yeah,
Optimal.
it's fine.
Optimal. Yes.
Yeah, whatever is the most optimal situation given the biology and the environment, is it possible that the state of things right now, the feminization of culture and what we call politicized feminism, the way things are going for society, is it possible that that is actually the natural state of affairs given the biology and the and the environment? Like, forget how you want things to be, but it is this actually like currently, like, as far as it, if we just approach it from an is point of view, is this the ideal society that we are actually seeing now?
As far as is concerned, I think so. For the simple reason that that is what we've arrived at,
Mm.
given the technological innovations that have come to pass, in addition to the political pronouncements that have been made, that have
Yeah,
been effected into law. It seems actually rather obvious that this is, in air quotes, the ideal society,
yeah,
because what else could it be given human nature,
yeah.
given the
I mean,
circumstances? It certainly, it would not be what it was 300 years ago. That's obvious because of the
yeah,
conveniences and what have you.
mm,
And I think we should maybe qualify ideal. Ideal in this context might not mean best or optimal, but simply what human beings, given any number of variables that we have on hand, are most inclined to.
yeah. Which is, I tend to think it is. I mean, as you say, this is what we have, so you would assume that this is how the most optimal system um, would basically reduce to. And it's interesting that in almost every, as societies, other cultures um, become more similar to the West. India, for example, as they've industrialized and they've had birth control introduced, India does the same thing. They kind of move towards a more feminist culture. I tend to think that that is the natural state of things given the environmental conditions we have. So that would then raise the question of what would what would you need to do to change it from the the natural is that these societies, including our own, are naturally moving towards, to what I guess the certain MGTOW or MRAs would consider their ideal society.
Well, I'm pretty pessimistic about the prospects of moving society in any specific direction other than the direction it's most naturally inclined to go.
Mm.
You see this. You see this certainly on the internet. People's inclinations, the way things work, the way YouTube works. We don't. We're human beings. We haven't changed much in tens of thousands of years, and even Girl Ice Watt has pointed this out many times. We're up against a juggernaut, a juggernaut that is essentially mindless, and that's of course the unconscious human instinct, right? That mindless juggernaut that
Yeah.
pushes society in a certain direction. Now, this unconscious human juggernaut of instinct is, of course, malleable to a degree, just
Mm.
as clay might be, but you cannot turn clay into gold or
No.
clay into water or some other element or chunk of matter. So, of
Yeah.
course, the malleability comes from the environmental changes, such as technology, such as political institutions prescribing laws and making things legal, illegal, etc. That gives that human instinct some malleability, but
Mm.
it is a juggernaut. It's unstoppable, and
Yeah.
the Barbarossa in that statement, he didn't offer any actual prescriptions, but I don't think we could come up with a better lie than feminism. And feminism, I mean, it's of course it's mendacious on some level. It is a lie
Mm.
on some level, but the mendacity is a very natural one. It's a mendacity that's derived from people's natural perceptions of things, and so that's why it feels so right. It's
Mm.
not in the case. Obviously, we've talked. I mean, Anita Sarkeesian. Yes, she is a shyster and a con artist. Okay, but as far as ideological feminists are concerned, they it's a dishonesty that feels correct. It's not one
Yeah.
that's very conscious. So, you know, coming up with a better lie than feminism would be quite difficult because that is human. That is the human inclination. It's women's inclination to believe that everything sort of belongs to them and they have what's coming to them because, well, they exist. And
Mm.
men's inclination to kowtow to that desire and give them whatever they want
Yeah.
and not question it, and also, in particular, not question the consequences that might arise from giving women whatever they want.
Mm.
So, in that sense, I think we're not going to be able to come up with a better lie than feminism.
Yeah.
So,
I,
go on.
I actually think Barbarossa. I think it was Barbarossa said it best that feminism is essentially female nature politicized.
I
Um,
we've both said that. Both
yeah.
said that. Yeah.
It's I don't even necessarily see it as a lie so much as that is the natural state of the female condition given the environment. You introduce industrialization, birth control, welfare programs. This is the world that you expect to see based on that. But it doesn't even have to be from an ideological standpoint. I remember one of the most interesting things on this that Barbarossa pointed out one time was he was showing some graphs on the when Obama was elected, and specifically the female trends for voting for Obama, and the key determining factor for whether or not a woman would vote for Obama or not was actually her marital status. And I'm fairly certain if you asked any one of those individual women, they'd be able to give you a whole bunch of rationalizations about policy and knowledge-based things about the economy. But it's interesting that that instinctual thing seems to have had a very noticeable trend at the aggregate level.
Yeah. 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 And it's also interesting that I might have been the first one to bring it up, but I was very vocal several years ago in saying that, feminism is basically female nature politicized, and this was a time when people had it was very clear, and I'm using air quotes, that feminism is an ideology and women are women.
Yeah. Yeah. Women
And
are a gender, and
right. And I think very few people, at least in the public sphere or the YouTube sphere, actually had considered that the way feminism operates is an extension of female nature. And given that, we're getting back to the problem we talked about before. I mean, how do you combat that? How and another point in relation to what Divided Line said, we have a problem accepting the is, right? We, as human beings, as conscious animals, as thinking apes, have a problem with the way things simply are. We create all manner of narratives and fanciful tales in order to obfuscate and disguise what we don't want to see in ourselves. And
yeah,
so if we were to accept that the whole ought is actually a valid means of approaching this, we can in fact design something, blah blah blah. I think we would have some serious issues, because we would be confronted with a lot of the things that I talked about in the Contented Irrationalist, with people having to shed their egos for the sake of objective observation, truth, etc.
yeah,
And I think that, if anything, if we were to even entertain the ought aspect, is the biggest problem. Absolutely. Because we tell ourselves these tales so as to avoid confronting unpleasant truths about ourselves.
yeah,
And I think that this is my own personal opinion and view. I think that is the fundamental problem and fundamental obstacle to human progress.
yeah. Well, I mean, in his comment, I mean, Divided Line was talking about, if we ever want to break this sort of biological autopilot that we seem to be running on at a societal level, that the first thing to break that chain of events is knowledge about ourselves. And I agree with him that if it's possible to break it, we must first understand why we make the choices that we do. The problem is that once you get to that point, you're like, okay, well, these things are biological, which means you need to fight innate biology. Secondly, a lot of the knowledge that what is the likelihood of society as a whole becoming self-aware of their own biological trappings and then working at great pains to try and fight against that biology for the betterment of society? It's quite improbable, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, as you said, like we spoke last week about the problem of obesity. I mean, that's an issue where
Knowledge.
well, people have absolute knowledge about the steps that they have to take to reach their ideal
Relatively
body
speaking, yes. Yeah.
body mass index, right? They know they have to keep a healthy diet, regular exercise, but if that can't even be maintained in the face of absolute knowledge, I mean, what chance have you got in as far as these things where do women want to give up the in-group preference? Do men want to stop white knighting? I mean, nobody wants to be obese, and if that can't even be overcome.
That's an excellent point. Absolutely excellent point. And yeah, this goes far deeper. It goes into the depths of what it is to be humans, what it is to be men and women. And absolutely, you can look at the obesity problem or any other health issue. Smoker, someone who's
Yeah.
a nicotine addict, same thing.
Yeah.
Knowledge is clearly not enough, and we have hard evidence to know that knowledge is not enough to correct a problem. In select few cases, it might be. So you
Yeah.
might find the odd guy who was, I don't know, 160 kilograms, and through tenacity and stubbornness and hard work, blah blah blah. He gets down to, I don't know, 90 kilos, and he's able to
Yeah.
maintain that. Okay, yeah, it's possible it happens, but most of them never get to that point,
Or
and that kind
they do get to that point,
and
but
they
they
yo-yo
can't
back.
maintain it.
And the same with smoking. I've seen the quit smoking forever thing is pretty rare in my observation. So in
Yeah.
most cases, it's not possible, and in a few it is. And even if we were to say, I'm arbitrarily making this number up, and 75% of the time it's not possible, 25% of the time it is, and apply that to
Mm.
human beings, well, that's 75% of the population of humanity. That's a huge number. There's
Yeah.
no, if only 25% of it is in on this knowledge thing,
Yeah.
and can actually implement it and apply it, it's pretty
Yeah.
useless.
Yeah.
So I just don't see
Yeah.
that happening.
And I mean, like I said, I mean, in these cases, we're talking about things where, I mean, nobody wants to be obese, nobody wants to get lung cancer. I mean, there's social faux pas surrounding both of those things. That's not the case for, men protecting women walking home at night or something like that.
Yeah, because it
It's
feels
kind of,
right. I mean, I think
yeah,
the difference there is, I mean, I guess suppose if you're lighting up a cigarette, it feels good, and stuffing your face with a pastry kind of feels good, but it's not the same thing. Once again, getting back to the ideal lie, the mendacity of feminists. I mean, it to the ideological feminist, it feels right, just like it feels right to most men to white knight for women.
yeah,
And it's not, they're not, it's not the perfect analogy, and because there's no social faux pas, it's encouraged by everyone, because that's what we're all naturally inclined to. I mean, certainly, say 10 years ago, I I'd be doing favors for women. I'd be holding the door for them. I'd hold the door for men too, incidentally. But it's just instinct. It's autopilot, and I want to get back to the point that I don't think people put a premium on knowledge. That's the other problem. As I keep on referencing this video, it wasn't a popular one, but in Contented Irrationalist, I really stressed the fact that people don't put a premium on knowledge, and people are much more inclined to, say, pursue, I'm using air quotes, happiness, instead of
mm,
facts that might in fact take away from their happiness. We see this in
yeah,
religion, saying religious delusion, or religious belief, and they're not necessarily the same thing. That you know, I I don't care if there's no evidence. Jeebus makes me feel good. I
yeah,
don't care if the male female nature is mutually exploitative. It makes me feel good to participate in it anyway, and I don't care about the potential harm that can arise from that, etc. So
mm,
that's to my mind the largest obstacle, in addition to the other thing I mentioned. The fact that human beings don't put a premium on knowledge as the most important thing, and that's
yeah,
the problem with divided lines argumentation. That assumes that people are most interested in acquiring objective knowledge, which I think,
yeah.
looking at the world, they're not.
Mm. Well, I think, I mean, even people that ostensibly are interested in pursuing knowledge, it is sort of like when it actually comes to decision time, the knowledge section of the brain is kind of the last part that lights up. Um, as I said before about the voting trends that Barbarossa pointed out, I'm sure if you asked any one of the women who voted for or against Obama, they'd give you a litany um, of reasons as to why they made the choice they did. But at the aggregate level, we see that the biggest determining factor was marital, relationship status.
Mm.
Um, these biological drives do seem to compound to the point where we see very different trends. I mean, it's the same thing with the wage gap, really. I mean, it's the same thing where if you asked any individual kid in school, what do you want to be when you grow up, you'd hear a whole bunch of different things. But, come time to actually enter the job market, women work sort of 8 to 10 hours less per week. they don't enter the same kind of jobs that men do. And, it's all very well to compare two people and say, look, this girl's an engineer, this guy's an engineer, why do men and women earn less? But, when you actually start looking at the trends driven by biology that kind of compound at the societal level, you start to see some very big differences.
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, this is why I think Barbarossa and I have both pointed this out. Even if you were to get rid of, feminism, capital F feminism, as I made this distinction a long time ago. I coined this capital F lowercase f. I got a lot of shit for it back in the day. That, capital F feminism being the official feminism, the people call themselves feminists, and lowercase f feminism being basically the masses of women who just go along with it unconsciously without actually declaring themselves as such. And even if you were to get rid of that, the Barbaros put this very well. The impact, the legacy of feminism is still going to be there. So, I mean, I hate to be pessimistic, but given the problems people have with putting a premium on knowledge, given how deep-seated these instincts are, and given the fact, as we just discussed, that knowledge, in fact, rarely seems to be an answer to many problems, mere knowledge, that is to take action to affect change.
Yeah.
We're in a boatload of problems if we actually want to go along the route and say, we can design a society along these lines.
Yeah. I mean, the problem for me is I can't see, given that this does seem to be the natural state of affairs, I don't see how we could design an ideal society without, A, people being aware of a lot of things that they don't want to be aware of, and B, once being aware of them, having to fight very hard against their innate biological instincts.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure. And I mean, it's not just divided line. I'm sure a lot of people have this idea that once you understand the biology, you can start building better systems based on that biology. But my question is how? Given the female in-group preference and the male's desire to white knight, what system could you implement to have a more fair society that accounted for those biological inclinations?
Well, you could propose a system, but the likelihood that the masses would go along with it is slim to nil, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can propose whatever you want, but I mean, what Divided Line was saying we should propose a system that takes these biological drives, the human nature, into account. And I just don't see how you can take that human nature into account, but then expect something different to what we have now.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, the assumption there, tacit or otherwise, is that women would want to give up their privileges and for the sake of some form of whatever that means. It's a separate discussion. Egalitarian society, and men are willing to give up essentially their own psychology, which is most men's a healthy psychology is dependent on the approval of women and the respect they garner from other men vis-a-vis their accomplishments that they perform for the sake of women.
Yeah.
So,
well, I don't even know, and I don't want to put words into Divided Line's mouth, but I don't even know if he was necessarily saying that the system would demand that women give these things up. I think I got the impression from what he was saying is that the system would have to take the desire for women to have those, benefits, female benefits and stuff, remain intact. But I don't know how you could accommodate those biological desires for, things like female-only train cars and stuff, or we're all under attack, we have to be protected. I don't see how you can accommodate those kind of behaviours into a system that would be more fair and reasonable, because they're fundamentally unfair and unreasonable to begin with.
Well, I think when it when it comes to biology and innate drives, reason has almost nothing to do with that stuff.
Mm.
Once again, I mean, if you want to look at it a different way, the sort of phobia of knowledge is just, people are not naturally rational. Rationality, absolute rationality is impossible, and we're all on autopilot, to varying degrees, of course,
Yeah.
myself included.
Yeah.
Trying to Rationality is not something you actually strive for, and as another important thing I mentioned in Content Irrationalist, which I think I'll provide a link to, is rationality isn't necessarily, in fact, many cases, isn't going to make you happy. It's in fact, it's been documented, for example, that religious people tend to be quote unquote happier and more content than atheists.
Yeah.
So
Ignorance is bliss, as the saying
essentially,
goes.
essentially, I mean that's kind of what it boils down to. So that's another thing. Someone would retort to all this, saying, well, why would I want to know that? It's going to make me feel bad and miserable and blah 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 blah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is, I guess, similar as well to, um, I mean, you were saying, the Spock phenomenon.
Mm.
Like, essentially, most people aren't Stardust. Like, most people can't sort of reach the level that you're at, for example.
And let me
Uh,
just, can I just, I hate to interrupt. I mean, recently there have been a series of attacks from, you can guess who, claiming that I dictate my views, my pursuit of MGTOW ideals, and dictate it to other people. And let me go on record for, I don't know, the 10,000th time and say this is simply my preference and the way I approach things, the world, and women. Anyway, please continue. I'm sorry.
yeah, well, just like, I tend to think that intellectual MGTOW are probably ahead of the curve, for the most part. But even then, most intellectual MGTOW aren't, they don't necessarily abstain. Like, as you said, Barbarossa doesn't, I don't. Um,
Which is perfectly
you're,
fine, once again, and I'm not offering any dictates, so don't ever try to claim that. Go on.
yeah, but just the the intellectual capacity to reach that level of understanding where even if you don't abstain completely, but um, be very careful about what you do. Like, try and be very careful about managing those emotional or instinctual drives. I don't think the average voting person is really going to be able to do that. I think that it's entirely possible that if you tried to force average Joe on the street into a Stardust type lifestyle, or even not even a Stardust type lifestyle, even like a Raging Golden Eagle type lifestyle,
Hmm.
it could be very psychologically unhealthy for that person.
Oh yeah, yeah. Look, once again, I mean, I hate to, I'm gonna be, called a narcissist. I'm talking about myself again, but my way of approaching the world and life, and my way of going my own way, is not necessarily healthy for most people. In fact, probably is unhealthy. I would suspect most MGTOW would not be content doing things the way I do them, but I am. Once
Mm.
again, not a dictate. But yeah, I think for the average blue pillar that just has no knowledge of this stuff, oh, he'd be fucking miserable. I mean, he'd probably go crazy, not enough social contact. He'd be sex starved, all of these things. He just wouldn't be able to function. He'd be non-functional essentially.
Yeah.
Which, that and someone as someone who pursues knowledge as an absolute to the exclusion of almost everything else, uh, yeah, that getting to that level, if it's even desirable, I don't know if it is. I just can say that's the way I am.
Mm.
That most people are not going to get there. Most people aren't
No.
even to get to the point where they think, well, maybe I should avoid official relationships because of X, Y, Z, and this is dangerous and what have you. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, it's not just a thing of whether it's possible. Like, if you did implement it, I don't know, at the end of a gun or something, I think you would have a very, very, I mean, you would have a logical, a logical society, I guess, but you would have a very unhappy one. I suppose
Yeah,
it's,
yeah, absolutely. I don't think I mean, I've said it a million times, rationality is not a recipe for happiness.
mm, like I personally think, like religion, for example, is quite a fake happiness. It's, it's, yeah, I don't think it's particularly a
Well,
good
so is the
thing, but
belief, Coltane, so is the belief that, your love for who you are, or something like that. It's on parity, essentially.
yeah, but whilst I don't agree whilst I don't think that, religious belief, as a substitute for meaning is necessarily a good thing, I don't think it was a particularly good thing either. The way, you try to Stalin and Lenin and stuff tried to prescriptively institute Marx and Engels, religion is the opiate of the masses and get
Yeah,
rid of it by
absolutely.
force.
Yeah, that's
You
terrible.
know, a lot of people were, it was not good for a lot of people.
Absolutely. No disagreement there. I,
Yeah.
people act the way they act, and yeah. Ultimately, if we could design some Spock society, which essentially would be a knowledge-based society based, purely on knowledge, the
Mm.
on say science, and up until fairly recently, science simply meant knowledge. It didn't mean that specialized form of knowledge.
Yeah.
Based on science, people would be fucking miserable. I would say 90. This is arbitrary. Most people would be miserable. 90% of them would be fucking miserable.
Yeah.
Most people just don't. They're not content with merely understanding things, and it's only for a select few people who like that sort of thing that's a nice path to follow. But the vast majority of human beings don't work along those lines. If
Yeah.
anything, it's just a secondary thing. And I've seen this particularly in regards to women in academia. I might have mentioned this a couple of times, but I'll never forget in studying formal linguistics some of these women who were, ostensibly quite good at it, but never were interested in theoretical discussions outside of the context of the classroom or the university itself.
Mm.
And it was just a job. And I think it reminds me of the female engineer you knew who was an engineer, albeit a reluctant one. She pursued it because the pay was good, for no other
Yeah.
reason essentially. And
Pay and status, basically.
pay
She
and
didn't. She didn't seem to have a deep love for the mechanical.
yeah, yeah. And my experience in academia was quite similar. So all the epistemological, if you will, this is just not of great interest to most people, and that would be the absolute prerequisite for a society that is designed by knowledge rather
Yeah.
than instinct. Because knowledge can often counter instinct, and actually runs counter to instinct.
Yeah.
And it will, as I think you're absolutely right, it's going to make a lot of people unhappy. Most
Yeah.
men, I'm going to say it, most men would not be happy going their own way. Whatever iteration of that might be, would be it a Barbarossa iteration, a Louis Marco one, or a Stardust one, most men would not be content going their own way, and it's just a fact. This is
Yeah.
why it'll never be some sort of mass movement or what have you. And I think we're sort of segueing naturally into the whole question of ideology.
Mm.
What is this? I hear this all the time, and it certainly is worthy of discussion. MGTOW ideology. I certainly want you to comment at length on this, but I just want to remark that this, if I recall correctly, first came up in the context of the long-haired Lord of Wales and master of musical din, Rocky Mr. E, when he started talking about MGTOW ideology several years back. And my own take on this is this has a lot to do with generalizing women and talking about the dangers of relationships, and particularly the dangers of marriage. But I want to hear your take on this.
Well, I mean, it's something that I've been hearing a bit recently as well. I've noticed Razor Blade Candy's used the term a couple of times in his recent videos, and I cringe every time he does. My problem with it is that no doubt there are ideological MGTOW out there, but I like to think that my flavour is more philosophical than ideological. Mine's more descriptive rather than prescriptive, and you know, I like to think that my beliefs are fairly well based on facts. That like the statistics that we see in society, and if new evidence came up, my understanding of things would have to change to meet those new facts. But I don't think it's ideological. Like feminism, I think is ideological, where they will talk about the pay gap, and you will show them the exact statistics that show that isn't the case, and the next week they're still arguing the same thing as if they'd never seen those they'd never seen those facts. I don't think most MGTOW are like that.
No, but there certainly are. I mean, one thing we've talked about briefly in the past, and I think it might be a good time to talk about it again in greater depth, is hypergamy, for example. Absolutely, that's a fact. But there is an idea that I think, based on the evidence that's been amassing, that women put up more of a premium on status and resources than the physical, than basically genetic fitness. And I think this isn't entirely environmentally based. And going back to what Girl Writes What said, or cited rather. I mean, this was a OkCupid eons ago. I was there as well. Like 8-9 years ago, OkCupid online dating site, where there was this poll. For those of you who don't know, and women were asked, what do you think of these men? And something to the effect of 80% of men were deemed below average, solely based on looks, mind you. Now, I think this and other things I've observed on the Ethernet and in society in general is pointing to something, that women are in fact just as interested in looks, i.e. genetic fitness. I mean, ultimately that's the whole point of, we should specify that, of reproduction, to produce genetic copies of the best fidelity and also the best genetic fitness, so they themselves can self-replicate. That the comforts and safety of society have allowed women to a certain extent put aside it's not a dichotomy, but the dual need for, yes, certainly money, resources, status, but also to put greater emphasis on their desire for genetic fitness in a partner. So this is actually part of the problem. And people I saw in the comment section on Girl Writes What video, the video I did with Girl Writes What, talking about, women only want 20% of da-da-da. Now, a lot of that has to do, I believe, with the fact that we're seeing a kind of cumulative effect. We have all the hypergamous stuff going on, that is the desire for status and money and blah, blah, blah. But now, because women are quote-unquote independent, be it vis-a-vis government or they're working on their own, they can afford to give greater allowances to their own preferences for genetic fitness. And so you have this dual thing going, where you have, they have the hypergamy, but they also want extremely handsome, in air quotes, genetically fit males. And so the pool of prospective mates becomes thinner and thinner and thinner. And this I think, runs counter to a lot of ideas in the manosphere that stress, for example, it's all about money and status. No. I think women are as interested in genetic fitness as males are. It's just in the past, there were so many environmental barriers to that it just never came to the fore, because at the end of the day, if you have to make a decision between this guy's genetically fit, but he's a bum and has no money so he can't raise children, versus this guy's less genetically fit, but he has this job and enough money to tide me over the rest of my life, what are you going to choose? All right. Sorry, just wanted to throw that out there. As we discussed, the need to modulate your own thoughts based on new evidence and facts.
Yeah, well, I mean, Tinder actually has some very similar statistics. I mean, that's a Tinder is a system where two people judge each other purely on the basis of looks. And if two people basically click like on each other based on looks, it's a match and you can start sending messages. The statistics on that are about the same, where men basically, I suppose if we want to use the terms you just did, men consider about 50% of the women to be genetically fit for reproduction. Women only select the men about, I think it was 17% of the time. So yeah, about the same. 83% of men are ungenetically fit, according to women, purely on the basis of looks on Tinder. However, I think it's more complicated. My guess would be that men essentially judge women almost entirely on genetic fitness. It's all about looks and
Agreed.
Whereas women have two factors, and I think in the broad scheme of things, I mean, I think that based purely on looks could be I don't know that we could take what you see on Tinder and OkCupid and extrapolate it to men and women actually intermingling in real life, because there are certain non-verbal cues and things like that you can't pick up from the internet. But I tend to think that if you put a bunch of men and a bunch of women together in a room, like speed dating, for example, I think women would probably see 50% of the men as genetically fit, but all things being equal, they would make their decisions on the basis of provision and resource acquisition.
That's not any different to what I said before, that if you have to make a choice between having a guy who's genetically... Well, let's talk about cuckolding. Cuckolding is a perfect example, the so-called beta provider. You have in the ideal female situation, I'm using ideal in air quotes, but the ideal genetic fidelity replication situation is to be married or otherwise in a relationship with a quote-unquote beta provider of lesser genetic fitness, but more than adequate or sufficient very good resources and decent status, but have the genetic inheritance come from another more genetically fit male. So you have the combination of genetic fitness with the resources being funneled and allocated from another man to the more genetically fit offspring. So I do think I think it's a comment on parity. The other thing, of course, that should be mentioned is women are naturally more cautious about pursuing sexual liaisons than men are, for obvious reasons that have been talked about a million times. So that's probably a factor in it as well. But it is, I think, revealing, and it shows that in the modern society of 2015, or whenever the older polls were taken in the early 2000s, that the environmental changes wrought have made women certainly a little bit more honest and open about their preferences. Whereas in the past, as I said, it just wasn't an option. You took the guy who had the resources for the most part. Whereas now, first off, cuckolding is much easier in this context because all the rules that and guidelines that used to run roughshod through society as far as marriage and what have you is concerned, they weren't present anymore. I mean, if a woman had been caught back then, she'd be thrown out in the street. But cuckolding is much more common in modern society than it used to be in previous ones, and I think that's
it is.
Yeah.
That said, it's also a lot less common than what I think a lot of people.
Oh yeah, I'm not. It's not that common.
I see numbers quoted anywhere from 10 to 30% of children, and it's actually closer to sort of between 1 and 3%, depending on the socioeconomic area you're talking about.
No, it's not as high, but I agree with you that it's inflated. The statistics on that are inflated, but the important thing that indicates or demonstrates is that women are, in fact, in a general sense, if the option is there, as interested in genetic fitness as they are in resources and resource allocation. But the point of all of this, of course, was simply to extrapolate away from the need to modify one's ideology, if you will, and we're using this in air quotes again,
I would
based
say
on
philosophy.
philosophy, yeah,
Yeah,
based on how much knowledge is available, and
yeah,
change. For example, maybe we were people that used to believe that cuckolding occurred at a 30% rate, and then we see it doesn't. We see,
yeah,
wow, it's more like 3% or 2%.
yeah,
And
yeah.
we
I
need to
mean,
modify that.
that still has implications. Like if you consider the effectiveness of birth control, um, how much how much sex has to be going on for a failure rate to basically say that even 1% of children are raised by a father that's not their own. I mean, if you work backwards on the basis that the pill is 97% effective, that's or condoms as well. They're, I think, what are they, about 85% effective over the course of a year. There has to be a lot of cheating going on for that 1% of cuckolds.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it's not like the 10, 20, 30% that some people quote.
No, but the thing is, the thing that would refute the idea, I don't know what Razorblade County is talking about, frankly, when he talks about this ideology, but
He usually only mentions it in passing. I honestly don't know if he just wrote the word ideology and didn't think too much about it. I really wish he would use the term philosophy, but
well, the important thing is that we be willing that to revise our opinions when we're confronted with new knowledge, and I have done that in the past, and our views need to be molded by that. I guess one way of putting it, we shouldn't be molded by our views. By our views, we should be the ones to mold our views based on the input that we're receiving from the world. I
yeah,
mean, for example, if it's never going to happen, but let's say everything I said about women, has been proven false. There, you know, 250,000 studies, done in universities across the globe. It just turned out to be a big hoax. I would have to concede that.
yeah.
I mean, it's not going to happen in regards to this, but
That would have to be a pretty big hoax.
that would have to be a pretty big hoax. Yeah. So this is an important thing, and I think ultimately that's the distinction between ideology and philosophy, if you will. But I think a lot of us, again, a lot of the ideology, this claim of ideology, comes from the position, the MGTOW position on marriage. We talk about the dangers of interacting with women in romantic relationships. We talk about the extreme danger of participating in marriage, which I sometimes refer
Yeah,
to as socially sanctioned slavery. I mean, people don't get the joke when I refer to relationships as marriages, and I actually refer to marriage as socially sanctioned slavery. The talk about the dangers of that, and people have this gut reaction. Certainly, someone like the long-haired Lord of Wales and Master of Musical Din, Rocky Mystery, who is married, and as
yeah,
we recently found out, Sargon of Akkad, who self-replicated himself quite recently. I mean,
yeah,
even without him being married, the fact that he self-replicated is an indication that he has, at least in part, been given to the state as he's a scion of the state, essentially.
yeah,
Now, if we point this out to people and say, look, interacting with women can have these potential consequences, and being in a marriage is that much worse, because you're giving your lease to the state, and the woman who is in cahoots with the state by default, whether that she's
yeah,
actually going to take advantage of that or not. It's the whole offense industry. Oh, you're generalizing women, but let me make an analogy. I mean, taken from your own home country. If a dweller of Darwin, or of North Queensland, and for those of you who don't know, these are areas that are heavily populated by giant saltwater crocodiles, grows up in those areas with guidelines about how to proceed along waterways so as to avoid saltwater crocodiles, or if you see one, don't do this. No, it's
yeah,
an absurd example, maybe, but I'm doing this intentionally. No one's going to say, well, you're generalizing saltwater crocodiles. Maybe you should pet some on the snout. They're not that bad. It's part of the offense industry. And what happens in that context is, once you've entered into a marital contract, or if you self-replicated, you don't need to. Even self-replication, having an offspring, puts you. I mean, you are a scion of the state. The state can exact punishment on you for not performing certain quote unquote duties, etc. I mean, this is something that these are all facts, and
Yeah.
this is then called ideology. To point these things out is then called ideology.
I think, again, going back to earlier, the problem again is description versus prescription. I think a lot of people, for the term MGTOW to have any meaning at all, you have to define something about it.
Right.
And I think the definition is fairly evident, in the acronym, men going their own way. If you get married, you can potentially be a couple going your own way together, but you cannot be a man going your own way at that point. You can't be that intrinsically, like legally and socially tied to another person and be going your own way. And that's not it's not prescriptive. Like if you want to go and get married and have 50 kids, have at it. You just can't use the term MGTOW to describe yourself.
I mean, it's exactly. It's, I mean,
they would take that, that description and try to apply it prescriptively and call it an ideology, which it's not. I mean, it's just a label to describe something.
Exactly. I mean, everyone's seen me now, so it's like saying, Stardust has hair when I've been bald for, 15 years. I don't have a shred of hair on my head, and so it's just descriptive. It's but I could be like them and take offense. Well, you have something against
Yeah,
this is an ideology, just calling bald people.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. If Rocking Mr. E, for example, was like, I want to, bald. The classification of bald should include people with hair. I'm like, well.
Not really.
You
it doesn't
can't.
work.
Sorry.
Yeah. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Really, not being married is just part of the description of MGTOW. It's a little more
it's not even necessarily saying people should be bald, but if you have hair, you don't get to call yourself bald.
Exactly. You're either bald or you're not, and you're either married or you're not. And if you're married, you're not a man going your own way by default, because whether the woman sees it that way or not, she owns you, and in part, and by liaison with the state owns you too.
Well, I'm not even talking about ownership. I'll give marriage the most
charitable
charitable interpretation I can, and say that these two people are, it's perfectly equal setup. They're perfectly happy together. They're on perfectly equal footing within their relationship. It's still two people who are choosing to live their life together.
Yeah.
It's not an individual going their own way.
Yeah.
MGTOW is an individualist position. You can't legally tie yourself to someone else and still try to maintain that individualist position. They're mutually exclusive.
I think that's the best way to put it. I think that actually, gentlemen, folks, that probably is the best way that's been put thus far. It's not even about you're married to the state, but it's the fact that, even if you're in a perfect relationship, it's two people doing things, whereas a man going his own way is someone who's just doing his own thing. And that is that's part of the reason why marriage just doesn't work within the MGTOW definition.
No. And as I said, that's not to say other people shouldn't be married in the same sense that saying other people should be bald, but you don't get to use that descriptor if you are married.
Exactly. I mean, if I have friends who, and it's come up occasionally, saying, I'm thinking about getting married, I tell them my thoughts on it, because I do consider them friends, and I leave it at that. Most of them are going to do what they're going to do anyway. I don't, contrary to what people have claimed about me, lies pronounced about me, I don't dictate to people what to do. I have a friend in South Korea incidentally Welsh as well, but he's a lot better than Rocky Mystery. And he's been with this girl for a couple of years, South Korean girl, and he's probably going to get married soon. And I imagine he'll probably self-replicate some in a few years down the line. And, I told him what I thought. And I said, this is the deal. And, if you ever decide to go back to the UK, watch out. And he may or may not do that, but he's going to do what he's going to do. I told him what I thought. It's not a person, and there's some people, as I said, some men need some sort of long-term relationship to be content in their lives. And that's not my experience. Long-term relationships, marriages, whatever you want to call them, man, they were sources of stress, distress, and just a pain in the ass. Why bother? That's just my perspective, though.
Yeah. And I mean, it's largely my perspective as well. And, I'm happy doing what I'm doing, but
clubbing cane toads.
Well, no cane toads where I live, but I don't know. For me, I think it essentially comes down to, everything that we've been talking about before. Description and prescription, that is-ought gap, where people if the definition of MGTOW logically cannot include married people, that's just an is. It doesn't necessarily. It's not an ideological ought.
Yeah. But people try to turn it into that.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean all men should be unmarried MGTOW. It just means, if you are married, you can't be MGTOW.
But Coltane, this is just a common problem. I'll never cease getting tired of it. But how many times I've described a phenomenon, right, and then my description of that phenomenon in a video is then somehow pretzelized into I'm an advocate for that, or I'm pro whatever the description might be. It's people have a hard time dividing that line. I try to be primarily descriptive and not prescriptive, and people talk about it. That means you're for it.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, in the past, I've probably made the mistake myself. I try to be as careful as possible nowadays not to do it. It's one of those things I learned a lot about these sorts of things, is-ought and stuff, when I was sort of peripherally involved in the online atheist community. But I think it's one of the most common mistakes that people make. They have it's a similar problem to the whole post hoc ergo propter hoc. People's brains have a way of trying to connect, they try to turn correlation into causation, and they try to turn ises into oughts. I think it's just part of the human condition where they like to. I think humans naturally want to have nice, neat rules that sort of explain how things connect together.
Yeah, and that also dovetail with their own natural inclinations.
Yeah. If it supports what you're doing at the time, which is, I suppose, a lot of what we've sort of been talking about is kind of much earlier on when I was talking about traditionalism, traditional marriage, and how it's really just slapping a descriptive label onto the most biologically convenient system at the time, given the environment. I think there's nothing prescriptive about it, and I think feminism is the same, where we've slapped this label of feminism onto what is essentially, the natural state of how women are going to advocate for themselves in a post-industrial, post-birth control world. I think in a lot of ways, ideological feminism is kind of a rationalization.
Yeah. Oh, there's no doubt about that. One thing I might... sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, it's similar to kind of what I was said last week regarding Sargon, where I pointed out the female in-group preference could explain a great deal about how feminism operates, where, you know, one woman gets attacked in a park at night, therefore all women are under attack. You attach, some type of ideological, politicized theories behind that, and then you've rationalized it. I think feminism itself is somewhat of a rationalization for these biological underpinnings.
Well, that's
Like
all it
these,
is,
it's
right?
like,
I mean, this is
yeah,
what we've been talking about for years. It's
yeah,
as you said, as you just said now. It's
mm,
I feel this way, and because I feel this way, the world it's moving from consequence to cause, right?
yeah,
Well, I feel this way, so the world must be this way because I feel this way, rather
yeah.
than looking at what produces the feelings to begin with. No.
Mm.
I,
Which is, I mean, as we kind of covered it last week, but yeah, then you've got the problem of, what are you hoping to achieve? What changes are you hoping to achieve by attacking the rationalization instead of the biology underneath that? I mean, can you change the biology underneath that? I don't think so, but
Right, and I think this is an interesting argument that a lot of people make. A lot of these, I'm going to argue with the feminists until I drop dead types of people. They'll say, well, this is something, I think his name was Stone, the one that Barbarossa
yeah,
responded to in a very long video. They'll say
mm,
something along the lines of, well, we can't change people's biology, so we need to do something else. So attacking the rationalization, the post hoc rationalization, they think that's the best thing they can do because even if they acknowledge that they're biological underpinnings, right? You
mm,
can't do anything about those, so you might as well just attack the rationalization, which is another. I mean, it seems perhaps even more futile than pointing out, feminists act this way because, for example, women have an in-group preference and they view themselves as one unit, and women feel more fear towards external threats than men do, etc., etc.
yeah,
That's more absurd than, to my mind, than talking about the root causes. Personally,
yeah,
but I feel that's how a lot of these perpetual, I'm going to argue with the feminists forever people are. They just, well, we can't do anything about the biology. We'll just argue with the rationalizations and how absurd they are.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, to me, it just kind of seems like a waste of energy, but have at it. I mean, like, I suppose, like, getting back to divided lines comment, though, I mean, then the question, like, the real question is, if these things are this way, you know, is there a way that you can incorporate these biological innate drives into a system that is more fair? Like, is there a way to
That's feasible.
pol- politically change these things that take that biology into account?
And even
So,
if so, the things you pointed out, is it feasible, right? Because as we
well,
said,
that's the question. Is like, I mean, if it's going to take these things into account, like the question is it feasible from the standpoint that is there anything that can be done that take these things into account? I
hmm,
would think that the innate desires of men and women, they're like, given the current environment, the best way to describe them would be maladaptive.
yeah, I've used
Um,
that
and
in the past. Yeah.
and I don't think there's a way to make. I can't see, given the environmental conditions that we have at the moment, I just cannot see a good way of turning those maladaptive behaviors around to being useful.
But not only that, not only the maladaptive aspects of it, but as you said before, designing a society, a knowledge-based society based on how human beings, uh, you know, in air quotes, should be, ought to be, you're going to get a
Yeah,
lot of miserable human beings. I mean, people want to fuck. They want to have quote unquote intimate relationships with people. They don't want. I mean, I don't think any man or woman wants to just. Even women, they might think that in private, but no one wants to sit at a table and say, "Okay, we're about to participate in a mutually exploitative business arrangement. I'll give you an allowance, and you'll suck my dick, and da da da." And nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to just say, "This is the way it is. This is how we interact." It's
yeah,
not going to make people happy. People want to, I call it the paint job. They want to put a
yeah,
paint job on everything. They want to cover it up. reality as it is not the way people is not a means to making people happy, generally speaking.
No.
So I think even if it were
Do,
feasible to implement a system, you would get a lot of
yeah.
unhappy people.
Yeah. Well, without it even being knowledge based, do you think it's possible to design an irrational system that is, you know, um, more useful than the one we have at the moment?
Uh, well, okay, if we're just talking about complete hypotheticals, I think, yeah, you know what comes to mind? I do think it's I mean, sorry, we're talking. Wait, are we talking hypotheticals, or do I actually think it's possible?
Well, just hypothetically, I mean, we
Okay,
can talk about whether it's possible after your
okay.
hypothetical.
So one of my favorite things, everyone knows Sam Harris, one of my favorite public intellectuals, when he talks about the usefulness of religion as a defense of religion, he's often
Mm.
referred to the multi-headed green skinned demon that torments you for eternity unless you're a perfectly ethical person and gives to charity and kind to everyone and birds and sparrows and blah blah blah. I mean that would be he points out that would be a super useful religion to have. Not a shred of it need be true, but it would be really
Yeah.
useful. So yeah, we could conceivably come up with some sort of bamboozling system that makes people act more equitably towards each other and more
Yeah.
fair in a more fair manner and stuff, what have you.
I
But
guess the difference there is where I'm not sure it's entirely applicable would be I'm not sure about what the biological underpinnings of religion are, um, beyond, I guess, um, rationalizations to try and explain, you know, the way things work in the world. Like, are we before the days of, astronomy, for example? Was it who was it? Apollo dragged the sun across the sky, for example.
well, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
whereas in this case, I'm not sure that you could just invent a green monster when you're actually dealing with tangible interactions between men and women who are biologically hard coded to act certain ways. I'm not sure that there is some green monster that you could just invent to do that.
Well, you could. Well, I'll give you a green monster. The governments would never do this. But what if, and this is not feasible, but what if, for example, divorce, that is an official marriage divorce, right? We're no
Mm.
different than just breaking up. There are no assets to be divided. It's buy, but you don't get it. You don't get a penny out of it.
Mm.
How many? Whereas when you're in the marriage, since you're quote unquote equal partners, you're participating, you're getting
Yeah,
tax benefits. Would that reduce the amount of divorces that take place? Probably.
yeah,
So that could be a green monster that has
yeah.
nothing to do with, which is I suppose somewhat rational because it's designed on one of the reasons why women tend to initiate divorce at the rates that they do.
Mm. I suppose that's true.
Just like the green-headed monster would scare people. I don't want to be tormented by the green multi-headed monster, so I'm going to be an ethical person. I
Mm.
don't want to lose the money my husband's giving me. I'm going to stay married to him.
Yeah. Well, the chances of those laws being reversed, though, I'm not quite
I
sure
said
about.
it's not feasible. I specifically said that's not going to happen.
Yeah. I
But
mean, one of the issues that I have, I mean, here in Australia is that under Australian law, almost all of our laws are written from a completely gender neutral standpoint. So it's not even a problem of the laws being
yeah.
unbiased. It's that
Hmm.
they are being interpreted by the,
Oh,
judges
well,
and
Coltane,
lawyers and
this is true
yeah,
of all criminal. I mean, look at my once homeland, the United States. I mean,
yeah,
there's nothing enshrined in law that's gender specific. There's nothing in the law that says, well, a man committing this manner of homicide gets 20.3 years, but a woman gets 13.4. I mean, that's
yeah,
not how it works, and that's the problem, right? Because we have our innate
yeah,
preferences and biases, and And that's
Yeah.
why none of that's feasible. I mean, there's no government's going to do it. Yeah, man, men are fucking getting ripped off. Okay, let's de-incentivize women. That's the way to do it. They're
Yeah.
not going to do that. That's a pipe dream. That's
Yeah.
all it is.
Yeah.
Which, of course, leads us back to I mean, so the problem with divided lines common, they're two aspects. One, it just doesn't seem feasible, and even if it were feasible, people would be pretty fucking unhappy, I think.
Mm. Yeah.
I think that's a conclusion we can reach on that one.
Yeah. Yeah. I I don't think it's feasible. I think it's improbable. Um, Not necessarily impossible, but yeah, I mean, the problem I have is that, I mean, you look at every time in history when somebody has tried to implement some kind of designed ideology that's going to be better for everyone, and it doesn't take, the natural state of affairs into account. When you try and force people to accept something at the end of the gun, you know, you end up with something like Soviet Russia, where the populace is largely miserable. Things just don't work so well if you try and fight the natural state of affairs.
I can't believe you're betraying your own leftist roots. How dare you?
Yeah, well,
Yeah. No,
but
no, I agree. I 100% agree with that. Yeah.
yeah,
Things,
I think that if anything was going to um, lead down the path of things getting better from our standpoint, it would essentially be that if things continue to get more and more toxic, and as Barbarossa calls it, the sleeping giant, if more and more men just kind of unconsciously opt out, and you end up with something similar to the grass eaters in Japan, where it's just too dangerous and for men to participate, and they sort of reach a critical mass. I mean, that's the only way I could kind of see it happening. And again, it's not designed. It's still very much emergent, based on the biology and the environment of the time.
yeah, absolutely. I think the grass eaters phenomenon is somewhat particular to Japan because there are in fact cultural. I mean, let's not obviously culture is derivative of biology, but the way that particular culture is set up,
Mm.
with the salary man thing. I mean, that just
Yeah,
that format. That's a lot of the reasons why herbivore men are herbivore men. Uh, that has to do with their father's generation and previous father's generation.
yeah,
Just that kind of setup. I mean, it's not too dissimilar in South Korea. I mean, being a salaryman, it's not a happy life. I mean, it's even more miserable for those dudes than it is in the West or in Oceania where you are, where yeah, you have your 9 to 5, but I mean, being expected to intoxicate yourself with alcohol, even though being forced to essentially, unless you be fired. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, who wants to do that? That's true in Japan and as well as South Korea. If your boss says, "Oh, you've worked 14 hours today, but fuck, man, we need to get drunk," you're going to get drunk. You don't. It's not
yeah,
a question of you want to or not. So and that both of these societies being Neo-Confucian conformist societies, I think that's what produced this really somewhat unique phenomenon of grass eaters that is not going to see the same kind of. We're not going to see the herbivore men of that sort in the West because we don't have the Neo-Confucian background for it, and we don't have that format of society. We'll
no,
see something else. I don't know what exactly it'll be, but it's
yeah,
not going to be holy shit. I don't want to spend 70 hours a week, drop dead in a heart attack, and obey my boss till death. I don't want to do that because that's not the way things are set up in the West.
yeah,
But if something were to come to pass, it'll just be as you said, yeah, or Barbarossa said, the sleeping giant. But I don't even see that happening. And I think I said most men are just they can't be content with any other model. And I'm not faulting them for that. I'm just being descriptive. Most men need female validation. They need quote unquote emotional intimacy with women. And without that, they crumble and wither. And that's just a fact. And
yeah,
I'm not judging them. I'm just describing it.
yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, I mean, Japanese men would have those same biological urges, and I
Right,
guess
but they have that
I
different cultural background that is making
they do.
ejecting them from it even more.
Yeah, and I think, we are starting to see certain things, certain cracks forming in our own society along similar lines, like, pickup artist culture and things like that, where they are trying to look for ways to satiate those needs without necessarily, um, signing up for the lifelong contract.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
But it,
it wouldn't, yeah,
I think with the difference between PUA and say the herbivore phenomenon, they're vastly different. I mean, herbivores
oh yeah,
tend to be, essentially asexual. They just don't bother with any of it. They kind of do their own thing. They do a lot of things I would never do. I don't have particularly feminine interests, working on manicures or hairstyle. Well, I have no hair, so that wouldn't work. But
yeah,
that sort of thing, it just doesn't really interest me. But PUAs are kind of, I guess, a crossbreed. I mean, because they're still very much
yeah,
motivated by by fucking, but
yeah,
they have a kind of awareness that
mm,
is lacking in, say, a blue pill man.
yeah.
I think,
I,
yeah,
I, I
more
I
likely a
guess what
PUA
I'm
expansion would be possible than a MGTOW one. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just pointing out that, I mean, we are starting to see subcultures that are growing, growing sectors where they kind of worked out that the traditional way of doing it isn't beneficial to them. They can get what they want without necessarily, as they say, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that seems to be a constant POA model. Folks, thanks for watching, or rather listening. We're going to wrap this up, I think, before we talk into eternity.
yeah, sort of
But
hitting the hour and a half mark.
hitting the famous hour and a half mark. So that's probably a good time to wrap it up. But as always, thanks for listening, and don't forget to leave feedback in the comment section. And hopefully, MGTOW talks with whoever the guest might be will be a continuous phenomenon. We can only hope. But until the next time, thanks for watching and listening. And don't forget, may the gods be with you.